turned into years, and the Signal Mountain murders became a cold case. The initial flurry of investigative activity gave way to a slow, persistent effort to keep the case alive. Detectives continued to review evidence and follow leads, but the trail had just gone cold. The case file remained on the desks of dedicated detectives, a symbol of the unresolved tragedy that haunted Signal Mountain. Nearly a decade after the tragic events of Signal Mountain, the case remained unsolved. The families of Richard Mason, Kenneth Griffith, and Earl Smock continued to seek answers, while the community struggled to move on under the shadow of the unsolved murders. But in 1997, a breakthrough emerged from the efforts of a determined detective revisiting the cold case files. Detective Larry Sneed had joined the investigation team with fresh eyes and a renewed vigor. Determined to uncover what had been missed, he meticulously reviewed testimonies, evidence, and the detailed timelines of the investigation. As he sifted through the information, a name that had surfaced early on caught his attention again: Frank Casteel. Frank Casteel had been a person of interest shortly after the murders. Known for his volatile temper and fierce protection of his property near where the bodies were found, witnesses had previously come forward, recounting their stories of threatening encounters with Casteel. Yet, without concrete evidence, the initial investigation had not pursued him very aggressively. Revitalizing the investigation, Detective Sneed began to re-interview witnesses and gather new testimonies. People who had encountered Casteel described a man obsessed with guarding his land, often resorting to intimidation and violence. There were times he'd patrol the boundaries with his gun, shouting at anyone who came too close. "We all knew to stay away from his property," said one witness. As more stories emerged, a disturbing pattern began to take shape. Casteel's erratic behavior and propensity for violence provided the missing link the investigation needed. To strengthen the case, forensic experts re-examined the ballistic evidence. Analyzing bullet casings and patterns, they found similarities with the firearm registered to Casteel, thus adding another layer of credibility to an emerging theory. Armed with new evidence and renewed confidence, Detective Sneed consulted with the district attorney. The time had come to take decisive action and seek justice for the victims' families. With an arrest warrant in hand, law enforcement meticulously planned their approach. The aim was to apprehend Frank Casteel safely and without incident, aware of his armed and aggressive nature. On the day of the arrest, police arrived at Casteel's home in force. Police officers established a perimeter while a small team approached his residence. The tension was palpable as they moved in, prepared for any possible resistance. Casteel answered the door, visibly stunned by the presence of law enforcement. He was informed of the charges against him, 3 counts of first-degree murder. As he was handcuffed and led away, the community held its breath, hoping this would finally be the end of their nightmare. News of the arrest spread quickly through Signal Mountain. Relief and apprehension mingled as residents grappled with the realization that the man responsible for the murders was someone they had known all along. Frank Casteel was a complex and enigmatic figure, both known for his reclusive nature and his aggressive defense of his property. Born and raised in Tennessee, Casteel's early life was marked by a series of personal struggles and a developing sense of mistrust towards outsiders. Frank kept to himself mostly, but when he did interact with people, it was often with a chip on his shoulder. He was fiercely protective of his land, almost to an obsessive degree, reported one neighbor. Casteel's property near Signal Mountain became his fortress. Over the years, his encounters with trespassers grew increasingly aggressive. Numerous locals had reported being confronted with guns, threatened, and ordered off his land. The behavior painted a portrait of a man on the edge, willing to go to great lengths to protect what he saw as his. As the police continued their investigation, they found that there had been several complaints against Casteel over the years, describing hostile and sometimes violent encounters. However, these incidents never escalated to the level of serious legal consequences. Despite the mounting evidence of his aggressive tendencies, none of these incidents had linked him directly to the murders. It was only through Detective Sneed's renewed investigation that a clearer connection began to emerge. Casteel's erratic behavior and proximity to the crime scene positioned him as a prime suspect. As Frank Casteel awaited trial, prosecutors began the arduous task of building a robust case. They meticulously compiled evidence ranging from forensic findings to witness testimony that illustrated Casteel's violent history. The legal team's strategy centered on presenting a compelling narrative that linked Casteel's past behavior directly to the murders. They aimed to demonstrate his motive, means, and opportunity to commit the heinous act. On the other side, Casteel's defense team prepared for a challenging battle. They sought to cast doubt on the prosecution's evidence, emphasizing instead the circumstantial nature of the case and suggesting alternative possibilities. One of Casteel's defense lawyers said, "We must stress the lack of direct evidence linking Mr. Casteel to these terrible crimes. Our focus is on presenting inconsistencies and gaps in the prosecution's case." Both sides worked diligently, preparing for what promised to be a contentious and emotionally charged trial. The stakes were incredibly high, not just for Casteel, but for the victims' families and the Signal Mountain community seeking closure. The trial began in 1998, capturing the attention of both local community and a national audience. Families of the victims, curious residents, and media filled the courtroom, eager for justice and answers. The prosecution began. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, today we present the case of a man whose actions brought immense grief to this community. Frank Casteel, driven by anger and paranoia, took the lives of 3 innocent men. We will show you the pattern of behavior that led to this tragic outcome." The prosecution laid out their case meticulously. Forensic experts testified about the ballistic evidence, emphasizing the similarities between the casings and fragments found at the scene and the firearm registered to Casteel. Witnesses recounted their encounters with Casteel, describing his threats and aggressive behavior. One witness had recounted, "Frank came out with his gun, yelling at me to get off his property. He looked like he was ready to shoot. It was terrifying." As the prosecution presented its case, the narrative of a man driven by rage and a fixation on protection emerged, connecting his past behavior to the murders. As the defense began their opening statement, "Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution's case is built on assumptions and circumstantial evidence. There are no eyewitnesses, no definitive proof linking Mr. Casteel to these murders. We urge you to consider the possibility of reasonable doubt." The defense countered by challenging the reliability of the witness testimonies and forensic evidence. They argued that many of the witnesses' recollections were influenced by fear and community rumors. One defense lawyer said, "Isn't it true that you didn't actually see Mr. Casteel with the weapon on the day of the murders? Your fear and uncertainty are understandable, but they do not equate to evidence." The trial progressed with dramatic twists and turns. Both sides presented compelling arguments, and the jury listened intently. aware of the gravity of their decision. For the families of Richard, Kenneth, and Earl, each day of the trial was an emotional roller coaster. They relived the pain of their loss through testimonies and evidence, clinging to the hope of finally seeing justice served. Frank Casteel's actions, said the prosecutor, on that faithful day were the culmination of years of violent tendencies. The evidence may be circumstantial, but it is powerful and undeniable when viewed in its entirety. We ask you to convict Casteel for the murders he committed. Defense attorney responded, reasonable doubt. That's all we ask you to consider. The prosecution has not provided definitive proof beyond a reasonable doubt. We implore you to see the gaps and uncertainties in their case. The air was thick with anticipation as the jury returned to the courtroom after days of deliberation. The fate of Frank Casteel and the hope for justice for the families of Richard Mason, Kenneth Griffith, and Earl Smock hung in the balance. The jury foreperson. We find the defendant, Frank Casteel, guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. The verdict brought a wave of emotion. Relief and sorrow washed over the families of the victims and the community members present. Their long journey for justice had reached a pivotal moment, yet the pain of their loss remained ever present. The presiding judge. Frank Casteel, for the murders of Richard Mason, Kenneth Griffith, and Earl Smock, this court sentenced you to 3 consecutive life terms without parole. Frank Casteel was led away in handcuffs, the weight of his crime surrounding him. For many, his conviction signaled the end of a terrible chapter and the beginning of the healing process for Signal Mountain. But for others, questions still lingered. Despite the conviction, the legal battle was far from over. Frank Casteel's defense team immediately filed appeals, arguing procedural errors, challenging the sufficiency of the evidence presented at trial. The defense lawyer. We believe there were significant mishandlings in this case, issues with the collection of evidence, questionable witness testimonies, and a reliance on circumstantial evidence. These points form the basis of our appeal. Over the next several years, the appeals wound their way through the legal system. Each appeal presented a painful reminder for the victims' families, reopening wounds that had only begun to heal. The defense sought to poke holes in the prosecution's case, questioning investigation's integrity and the validity of forensic evidence. They aimed to sow reasonable doubt and secure a new trial or overturn the conviction altogether. Despite the vigorous efforts of Casteel's defense team, the appellate courts upheld the original conviction. The evidence, though circumstantial, was deemed sufficient to affirm guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The final appeal was denied, solidifying Casteel's life sentence. The families of Richard Mason, Kenneth Griffith, and Earl Smock could now begin to move forward. Their pursuit of legal justice finally concluded. The long-term impact on the families of Richard Mason, Kenneth Griffith, and Earl Smock was profound and enduring. The loss of their loved ones remained a constant source of grief, but the community's support became a pillar of strength. Annual memorial services became a tradition, allowing the community to honor the memories of the 3 men and reaffirm their commitment to support the affected families. These gatherings were a source of solace and unity, highlighting the resilience of the Signal Mountain community. One community member spoke and said, "It's been years, but we come together every year to remember Richard, Ken, and Earl. It's our way of keeping their memory alive and showing the families they're not alone." For the families, the journey through grief was long and arduous. They found ways to channel their pain into positive action, advocating for victims' rights and supporting others who had suffered similar losses. One family member spoke. "We lost a huge part of our lives when Ken, Richard, and Earl were taken from us, but through the support of our community and the strength we found in each other, we continue their legacy of love and kindness." The community established events and charities in the victims' names, transforming their remembrance into actions that benefited others. Scholarship funds, community outreach programs, and support groups were all part of the lasting legacy of Richard, Kenneth, and Earl. Despite the conviction and the passage of time, debates and alternative theories about the Signal Mountain murders persisted. Some questioned the strength of the circumstantial evidence used against Frank Casteel, while others believed that justice had been rightfully served. One analyst noted, "The case against Casteel was compelling, but it relied heavily on circumstantial evidence. This has led to the ongoing debate about whether the right person was convicted," they said. Various alternative theories emerged over the years, suggesting that other suspects or motives had not been thoroughly investigated. These theories added layers of complexity to an already intricate case, fueling true crime forums and discussions. Another legal expert noted, "The lack of concrete evidence means that there will always be room for doubt and speculation. It's the nature of circumstantial cases. They leave some questions unanswered." Local residents had mixed feelings, with some unwavering in their belief in Casteel's guilt, while others entertained the possibility of innocence. One resident said, "I believe Casteel did it. His behavior and the evidence presented made it clear to me. But I understand why some people have doubts. It's a complicated case." Another resident said, "There were so many things that didn't add up. I can't help but wonder if we have the whole story or if someone else was involved and got away." The Signal Mountain murders are a haunting chapter in Tennessee's history, a stark reminder of how quickly tragedy can shatter the tranquility of a community. The loss of Richard Mason, Kenneth Griffith, and Earl Smock left an indelible mark, but their memories live on through the enduring spirit of their families and friends. The journey for justice was long and fraught with challenges, but it brought the community closer together. The legacy of the victims is not one of violence and loss, but of love, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of truth. May their stories remind us of the preciousness of life and the importance of standing together in the face of adversity. May the memories of those three men be a blessing, and may we continue to seek understanding and justice in their honor. In gratitude, special thanks to the families of the victims, local law enforcement, community members, and legal experts who provided invaluable insights and support for this comprehensive recounting.